All right. So last time we left off in verse number 33 of chapter 11 of Daniel. We're going through verse by verse of this chapter, and so far we're seeing the faithful word of God in declaring what was to transpire with kingdoms, with nations, the conflicts that it will arise amongst them. So we left off in verse number 33. We're going to read it, and it reads, "And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days." For how long does it say? You guys recall how many days was that the church was going to be persecuted? It was going to be fall by the sword, and by flame, and by captivity. Do you guys recall the time period? 1,260 years. You guys recall when did that begin? In what year did that time prophecy begin? 538. The year 538. Let us go to verse number 34. And it says, "Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. But many shall cleave to them with flatteries." So let's look at this word right here, or this sentence, "holpen with a little help," because we're going to be looking at this. This is another verse in the Bible, or there is another verse in the Bible that speaks about God's people receiving help. And we're going to get to that, but let's continue to read now verse number 35. "And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because is yet for a time appointed." So there is a time prophecy, a time appointed, beginning from 538, adding the 1260-day prophecies. This is the situation that the church or God's people was to experience. Now it said that they were supposed to receive help, right? In verse number 34, that's what it said. Now we're going to go to Revelation, where we're going to read also, John the Revelator also received a similar description of God's people being persecuted and receiving help. That is Revelation chapter 12, and starting off at verse number 4. "And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days." That is the 1260 days. Now, who was persecuting this child? Or to begin, who is this child spoken of right here? Jesus. What power was looking to devour this child? Well, is Satan behind whom? Or who was he working through? What power was he working through? Caesar, Rome. So we see here the dragon. In this prophecy, we see that the dragon here is symbolizing the Roman Empire. And then we see here that the woman fled into the wilderness. Okay, so this is where the woman went. Now, notice that the verse says, "And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations, and that the dragon was ready to devour it." This indeed happened under the Roman Empire. And that is found in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 16. "He gave the order to kill all children from 2 years and under." 2 years and younger. He gave that order. So this did happen under the Roman Empire. Now let us jump to verse number 13 of that same chapter. And when the dragon, which is Rome, saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth a man-child. And the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and a half a time, from the face of the serpent. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, and that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened up her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. You remember that? In Daniel 11, says that God's people was to receive help. Here in Revelation chapter 12, verse 16, it says, and the earth helped the woman. So we see Revelation and Daniel speaking about God's people being persecuted for 1,260 days, or for a time and times and a half a time. But she was to receive help. That is in verse number 34 of Daniel chapter 11. Now, what was this help? Could anybody think of what was this help that God's people was to receive? Well, in the following, I'm going to share with you a video. It's a 4-minute video, but it's going to describe what transpired in that period of time that God's people was receiving help.
The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century shook the very foundation of Europe's cultural identity. The Reformation was a revolution of religion in Western Europe. Essentially, it was the result of centuries' worth of political and social grievances against the Christian church as it existed. Christianity, which began as a fledgling religion in the 1st century, had grown by the 13th century into an institution powerful enough to rival state governments. For instance, the Pope, then the leader of the Christian church, had greater political and military influence than some emperors and kings. This tension was exacerbated by the transformative social and intellectual period known as the Renaissance. In particular, this period involved the rise of humanism, a philosophy that shifted man's fate from being determined by religious doctrine to being determined by man himself. Additionally, some within the church believed it had become increasingly corrupt. Priests like John Wycliffe of England and Jan Hus of Bohemia challenged the church's teachings, which they believed had strayed away from the Bible. However, one of the most well-known advocates for a Reformed Christian church was a German priest named Martin Luther. Martin Luther began to question the church in the early 1500s. He believed it was abusing its power and disagreed with some of its practices. For instance, he challenged the church's doctrine that stated the Pope, not the Bible, was the ultimate spiritual authority. Plus, he criticized the church for selling indulgences, the practice of purchasing forgiveness for one's sins by giving money to the church. Luther believed the church needed to revise its doctrine by returning to the Bible's teachings and by saying that salvation could be granted by faith in Christ alone. So on October 31st, 1517, Luther took a stand. In what's considered the birth of the Protestant Reformation, Luther is said to have nailed 95 theses, or arguments against the church, onto the door of Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany. Luther was later put on trial in front of church officials to defend his theses, but in January 1521, the church declared Luther a heretic and excommunicated him. While Luther's membership with the church ended, the Reformation he argued for started to gain momentum. Unlike Luther's predecessors who challenged the church, Luther had one tool at his disposal that they didn't have: the printing press. This new invention allowed his arguments to be copied and spread across Europe. This unprecedented access to ideas, such as Luther's, inspired many others to challenge the Church, thereby splitting Christianity into two major denominations, Catholic and Protestant, from the word protest. Also, the Bible became more accessible. Luther and other reformists translated biblical text from Latin, which was only known by nobility and church officials, to German, English, and French, languages spoken by the general public. While the Protestant Reformation revolutionized the Christian faith, it had ramifications that extended beyond religion. Prior to the Reformation, many Europeans were dependent on an educated upper class. But perhaps the most resounding impact of the Reformation was that the common people were empowered to question religion and other aspects of life. The Reformation, along with technological innovations and the introduction of other new ideas, gave many in Europe's general public the freedom and power to decide their own fates.
So this is the help. Although God's people was being persecuted and put to death by sword, by flame, there were others arising that wanted to know the truth and knew that there needed to be a change within their own church to go to Bible principles. And not only did that happen, but that printing that Martin Luther had available in his time, he was able to print his beliefs, Bible scriptures, and be able to distribute that. That way, the gospel of Christ was spread out even quicker. Because all you had to do is just hand out a literature and people will read it. There were some, I believe it's the Valdenses, they had even a method to try to and share the gospel. They would sell pots, and inside the pots they would put scriptures or little papers, for them to read, because they were being persecuted. So this was that little help that was to transpire. But besides the God's people being persecuted, we read in previous verses 32, it says, "And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits." So during this time, you will have some that would apostatize or give in because of fear of their life, to be put to death, to be cast out as an enemy of the state. But there were others that were strong and firm in God's word and trusting in Him. So now let's look at a little quick review of what have we seen so far. We see that all the kings mentioned in Daniel chapter 11 are government powers. You had Media and Persia, you had Greece, now you had Rome, you had the king of the north, king of the south, which is Egypt. All of those government powers striving to have world dominion. Now, king of the north is toward the north of Jerusalem, and the king of the north is being spoken of in the verses 5 through 15 of chapter 11 of Daniel. And king of the south, which is Egypt, or south of Jerusalem, is being spoken in the same verses 5 through 15, and then verses 25 and 29. And then an introduction of Rome with the description of robbers of thy people, mentioned in Daniel 11, starting from verse 14 and reaching out all the way down to verse 35, as far as we have seen in this study of Daniel 11. Now, there is a mention of the transition from pagan Rome to papal Rome, and church and state uniting. That is when the daily is taken and the abomination that maketh desolate is put in place. That is Daniel chapter 11 and verse 31. And the little horn, which is mentioned in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25, is diverse from the first horns. It receives authority. All the other kingdoms, they fight and conquer. But the little horn is also described differently from the others. It was little compared to the other 10 horns. It was not of the same magnitude. It was not of the same size. It was a religious power. So in order for that religious power to have that authority, it needed to be given by Rome. So all this chapter so far is speaking of political powers, of kings, conflicts amongst them. Now, let's see then what transpired in verse number 36 of Daniel 11. Okay? And we read, "And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and he shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. For that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of woman, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all." So there are a few things I would like to mention. He will magnify himself above every God. Okay? And then it also says, nor regard any God. Let's continue to read verse number 38. "But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor, with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain." So we're going to look at a few things here mentioned. He shall honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not. And it mentions that it was a strange God. Let's jump to verse number 40. "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." So we see these descriptions given of this power. So we need to understand, and at that time of the end, what year is at the time of the end? The year in which the papal's power was to cease. Period of 1260 years, beginning in 538 to 1798. That is at the time of the end, 1798. So let's look at some descriptions from this king that is spoken of in verses 36 all the way through 40. It says, "It shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every God. It shall speak against the God of gods. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of woman, nor regard any God. Then he shall exalt a God of forces, a God whom his fathers knew not. And then at the time of the end, make war with king of the south and king of the north in 1798. Question is, who is this power? When did Rome have these characteristics of not even regarding any God and exalting a God of forces, a God whom his fathers knew not? And when in 1798 did this power, or whom in 1798 made war with Egypt and that who represented the king of the north in 1798? When did Rome fulfill such details? There is not one which it fulfilled these kind of details. Rome. We're not speaking about a religious power, because remember, all throughout Daniel 11 is speaking about governments, kings. That who it's speaking about. What kingdom or what country put into law that they shall not regard any God, that they shall not regard the God of the fathers, and then exalt the God of forces? What country was this? So here's a little chart. We got Daniel 11, just to go over the time frame. The daily taken away, that is paganism to Christianity in 508. And then we have the abomination that make it desolate, where people have absolute power. Those Aryan tribes, which the Catholic Church called heretics, we know that they were not heretics, but they removed the last Aryan tribe, the Ostrogoths, in 538, giving full authority to the Pope to have persecuting or political power. Then you have the many days. I'm sharing that chart so we could see. But then verses 36 and 39. We saw that when God's people were being persecuted, they were to receive help. We saw the testimonies of John Huss, Wycliffe, Martin Luther, all that transpiring during 1500s and even 1600s and even close to the end of the 1700s. So this verse has to take place somewhere after the 1789, near the close of probation, or near the close of that time at the end, which is 1798. What power abolished worship? What power became atheistic? And what power later on introduced a God whom his fathers knew not? That was France. France is the only country, or the only country in history that became a country with such characteristics. Hope you can read this, but we're going to read this portion here in the bottom. It says, the prehistory of laicite began prior to the French Revolution of 1789, when the monarchy and the Roman Catholic clergy held the greatest authority in France. The revolution sought to abolish the monarchy and the clergy's political control. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizens, 1789, written with the help of Thomas Jefferson, provided for the free exercise of religion on the condition that it did not disturb the greater society. This proviso's public-private economy meant that religion could be freely observed in private but regulated in public. So here we're starting to see the decline of the political power that Pope had. France was wanting to remove that authority, beginning when? In 1789. But did it stay like that? Did France stay that it was peacefully giving people the freedom to worship? Well, let's see history. This is from the Institute of World Politics. The dechristianization of France during the French Revolution. Look at what it was being shared during that French Revolution. Every sensible man, every honorable man must hold the Christian religion in horror. That's by Voltaire. Some other quotes. Man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. Another one. Religion has ever filled the mind of man with darkness and kept him in ignorance of the real duties of true interest. It is only by dispelling these clouds and phantoms of religion that we shall discover truth, reason, and morality. Religion diverts us from the cause of evil and from the remedies with which nature prescribes. Far from curing, it only aggravates, multiplies, and perpetuates them. These are not kind words towards a religion, right? What happened to that freedom that they were expressing in 1789? Here we continue to read what it also says. The revolution's impact on the spiritual aspects of French culture was the result of a number of separate policies devised by various French governments between 1789 and the Concordat of 1801. They formed the basis of the gradual trend toward dechristianization, later transformed into a less radical laicity. Most scholars would argue that the goal of the revolutionary government between 1793 and 1794 ranged from the public reclamation of the massive amount of land, power, and money held by the church in France to the termination of religious practice and the extermination of religion itself. La Constitution Civile du Clergé was a law passed on July 12, 1790, that resulted in the immediate subordination of the Catholic Church in France to the French government. It proved to be one of the most ill-judged, controversial, and disruptive laws of the French Revolution. The attempt to restructure the church during the time of the National Convention turned into open aggression against Catholicism and religion in general. Religious practice was outlawed and replaced with the cult of the Supreme Being, a deist state religion. The program of dechristianization waged against the Christian people of France increased in intensity with the enactment of the law of September 17, 1793, also known as the Law of Suspects. It was used to carry out more actively the following measures. All priests and all persons protecting them are liable to death on the spot. The destruction of all crosses, bells, and other external signs of worship. The destruction of statues, plaques, and iconography from places of worship. In 1793, the Christian calendar was replaced with one reckoning from the date of the Revolution and the festivals of liberty. Reason and the Supreme Being were officially established. During the 2-year reign of terror, anti-clericalism became more violent than any other in history. An especially notable event that took place during France's process of dechristianization was the Festival of Reason, which was held on November 10, 1793. Remember, it's nor regard any God, nor the God of his fathers. Right? And now look at what happened on November 10, 1793. In Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, on the main nave was placed an improvised mountain on which stood a Greek temple dedicated to philosophy and decorated with busts of philosophers. At the basis of the mountain was located a torch of truth. Some loose living girls took occasion to celebrate at the main altar the cult to the goddess Reason, while Phrygian bonnets on their heads. So after being an atheistic power, after abolishing worship of any deity, they introduced the goddess of reason. Pierre Gaspard said the following, or is written about what he did during this French Revolution. Strenuously anti-Catholic, he organized the first ceremony of the worship of reason. I want to reiterate, this France abolished religion, was persecuting those who practiced it, but later on introduces the worship of reason, personified by an actress. In Notre Dame Cathedral, November 10, 1793. His order to close the parish churches, November 23, 1793, remained effective despite the attempted intervention of Maximilian Robespierre. Also that month, Canute persuaded the Commune to ban women's participation in political debates and demonstration while denouncing such actions as contrary to nature. His antipathy to the Girondins may have caused the leaders of the Reign of Terror to fear him as a potential leader of the sans-culottes, lowest classes, although he had not aided the advocate of sans-culotte insurrection, Jacques René Helbert. Comet was arrested and executed after the Herbertists were suppressed in March 1794. So, France abolished worship, then introduces the goddess of reason. And not only that, if you look in history, in order to try to do away with anything related with Christianity, they even did away with the 7-day week. And some say they introduced a 10-day week period or an 8-day week period. All in order just to do away with Christianity. And then another thing that they did, and we're going to see later, is that they allowed divorce. Divorce where you could be divorced no matter what reason. But France, we're speaking about the desire of woman, because when you love a woman, you get married to the woman. So the normal desire of woman is to do or give a law which gives permission to divorce for no reason whatsoever. Let's see what else happened in 1798. Because remember, this power, if it's France, near the end of 1798 was doing all of this. Atheistic power, later on introducing the goddess of reason, and then doing away with or allowing divorce. Let's see what else happened. The French Revolution and the Catholic Church. In 1789, Catholicism was the official religion of France. 5 years later, worship was suppressed. The French Revolution posed problems for religion, but religion also posed plenty of problems for the new republic. Here in the bottom we read, on 23 November 1793, churches were closed to be converted into warehouses, manufacturing works of even stables. Streets and other public places bearing the names of saints were given new, often Republican-themed names, and time itself was recast to further repudiate France's Christian past. The revolutionary calendar started with the advent of the French Republic, year 1. The name of its months reflected the seasons, and its 10-day week eliminated Sunday as a day of rest and worship. Although such measures were unevenly applied and in many cases met with considerable local oppositions, they reinforced the message that Christianity had no place in the Republic. Further on, it says, the revolutionary government had learned, however, that when destroying the past, it was wise to have something to put in its place. The creation of the Republic in 1792 had given rise to ceremonies and festivals that aimed to make a religion of the revolution itself, commemorating revolutionary martyrs as its saints and venerating the tricolored cockade and red liberty cap as its sacred symbols. Prominent among such revolutionary cults as they were known was the cult of reason, which recognized no God but instead worshiped the goddess of reason in the former churches, now known as temples of reason. Robespierre, wary of atheism and the political forces behind certain cults, introduced on May the 7th, 1794, the cult of the Supreme Being, which he envisaged as a new state religion. The same characteristics given from 36 to 39. We still need to determine verse 40, right? Because it says at the time of the end, he was going to wage war with the king of the south and king of the north. And let's see what Sister White said about this France. France is the only nation in the world concerning which the authentic record survives, that as a nation she lifted her hand in open rebellion against the author of the universe. Plenty of blasphemers, plenty of infidels there have been, and still continue to be in England, Germany, Spain, and elsewhere. But France stands apart in the world's history as the single state which, by the decree of her legislative assembly, pronounced that there was no God, and of which the entire population of the capital and a vast majority elsewhere, women as well as men, danced and sang with joy in accepting the announcement. So these are political powers, like I said. Daniel chapter 11 deals specifically with political powers. And the church, during the persecution, had influence over this political power. But it was not the king. Remember, the little horn is given for a specific reason, that description, little horn, because it's not held as a king as other governing or political powers. It was given authority, but it was not a king like the others. That's why the description of the little horn was different from all the other 10. Let's see what else let's get this now in perspective. We see then that France indeed covered this time period of verses 36 to 39. During that period, which they abolished worship, they put in the law where you could divorce, and after being an atheistic power, introduced the goddess of reason. Now, as we read in verse number 40, it said, and at the time of the end, the king, right? The king is going to make war with the king of the south, which is Egypt, and the king of the north. But let us continue to read what happened with France. Here we read, on February, start reading, the killing of Dufat was the opportunity the Directory had been waiting for. Since Napoleon had recently returned to Paris, the Directory ordered its new commander in Italy, Louis Alexander Berthier, to march against Rome and avenge the death of Dufat. Berthier and 15,000 soldiers moved into the Papal States unopposed, and on February 10, 1798, at the time of the end, encamped outside the walls of Rome. 3 days later, Berthier entered the city and took Pope Pius VI prisoner. Berthier demanded that the Pope abandon his temporal authority. Remember, power was given it to him. Abandon his temporal authority over Rome and the Papal States and leave Rome itself for good. Pius replied that Pius replied that his authority had come to him from God, and he could not justly abandon it. Berthier resorted to force. He declared the Pope deposed and proclaimed Rome a republic. The 80-year-old Pius was banished from the city, and on February the 20th, 1798, French soldiers dragged him from Rome. That's the beginning of that at the time of the end. But it matches the prophecy. He was to be given authority to persecute God's people for 1,260 years, beginning from 538 and ending in 1798 of February 20, 1798. But let us read now verse number 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, that is France, and the king of the north shall come against him, The him is France, like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. So who is at him referring to? That's France. That political power which fits the description given in verses 36 to 39. But now it's saying that at the time of the end, there was to be a war. Was there a war in 1798 that involved France, Egypt, and King of the North? Remember, the King of the North was a country that occupied the Seleucid kingdom towards the north of Jerusalem, where Syria, that area is at. Was there a war at the time of the end that involved these three powers? The powers that's south of Jerusalem, Egypt, France, and that power that points toward the north of Jerusalem, the areas of Syria. Well, in fact, there was. Egyptian campaign. From 1798 to 1801, an Anglo-Ottoman alliance competed with the French for control of Egypt. Their victory resulted in French troops withdrawing from the region and also helped safeguard Britain's possession on the Indian subcontinent. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt and Syria. See, that king of the north and king of the south. This battle, in fact, happened in 1798. The French expedition to Egypt and Syria, led by Napoleon Bonaparte, aimed to establish a French colony in Egypt and to threaten British possessions in India. Despite initial French victories, the campaign ultimately ended in failure, and Egypt remained under Ottoman control. The expedition also led to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone and the birth of modern epitomology. So we see this. God prophesied this. He gave this prophecy, giving us a description of where at the time of the end is and what was to transpire during that time. It was not the Pope, because the Pope was taken prisoner. He couldn't make war with Egypt or Syria. He was already in prison. So who made that war at the time of the end? Was France going into Egypt, but then later on being pushed out by the king of the north, Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire. Look at what we read in verse 41 so we could see more description of this conflict. He shall enter also into the glorious land. That's speaking about the king of the north. And many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Did this happen after that war that the king of the north, the Ottoman Empire, all of a sudden pushed France out of Egypt and then take possession or the treasures of Egypt? Did this happen? Well, so far, the word of God has been true, right? So far. Let's read what happened. With Ottoman Empire, did they really take possessions of their goods, their silver, their treasures of Egypt? Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, born 1769, Ottoman Empire. Died August 2, 1849. Was the Pasha and Viceroy of Egypt. Founder of the dynasty that ruled Egypt from the beginning of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th. He encouraged the emergence of the modern Egyptian states. What else does it say? Administrative and economic reforms. Look at these details, just like the Bible predicted it. To strengthen his position with Egypt and to increase his revenues, Muhammad Ali instituted sweeping changes. By 1815, most of Egypt's agricultural land had been converted into state land, and profits from agriculture became available to the ruler. He improved Egypt's irrigation system, in which its agriculture depended. He introduced new crops, such as cotton, which promised high cash returns, and he recognized the administrative structure of the government to ensure strict control of the economy. He also attempted to construct a modern industrial system to process Egypt's new material. Disbanding his mercenary army, he created a fleet of an army of Egyptians conscripted from the peasant class but commanded by Turks and other recruited from outside Egypt. To supply services for his armed forces, he created Western-style schools to train doctors, engineers, veterinarians, and other specialists. He also began sending educational missions to European countries for training in modern techniques. He controlled that. He helped them supply, but there is also a command or a title given that Egypt was to pay taxes to Ottoman Empire. That is called the Khedivate of Egypt. You will see that indeed Egypt was paying tribute to the Ottoman Empire after Ottoman pushed France out of Egypt. So we're going to end with the following verse. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. All this was happening with the Ottoman Empire. So Ottoman Empire pushes away France, controls Egypt, which is silver and gold in his crops. He's being paid tribute. But then, verse 44, speaking of the king of the north, the Ottoman Empire, it says that out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him.